This is the fourth in a four-part series that we have asking the question, is the New Testament a reasonably reliable historical document? And in order to answer that question, one of the key points is there enough manuscript evidence that we can trust the documents? In other words, are the documents that we have today the same ones as were originally written by the disciples thousands of years ago? In order to be able to answer that question, we need to check on a couple of things. Because what we know about ancient documents is that the kind of paper or papyrus that they were written in eventually disintegrated over time, and so we don't have any of the original documents like locked up in the Vatican somewhere. Instead, what we have is copies of those documents, or perhaps copies of copies, or copies of copies of copies all the way on down. And what we have to ask is, are the copies that we have right now close in time to the originals that were being written, or further away? Obviously, the further away they were, the more chance there was that there's been changes from the original to the documents that we have. The other question that has to be asked is, how many times were they copied? How broadly were they copied? Because if there were lots and lots of copies that were very broadly distributed, then you probably have the same as the originals. If there were fewer copies that were made, then it would be easy for a monk or some transcriber to be able to change a piece of it, and then you wouldn't have anything else to compare it to know that he actually changed it. But if there's many documents out there, you would know if a change took place in one of the documents, say 100 years later. So how does the Bible compare to the rest of documents on these two scales for manuscript evidence? The first one is, how much time gap is there in between the time the document was written and the time that the earliest copy that we have in our hands is right now? Well, the second place to the Bible, to the New Testament, is the Iliad that was written by Homer. And there was a 500-year gap from the time that the Iliad was written until the time that the earliest manuscript that we have right now. Other contemporaries would include Demosthenes, who has a 1,400-year gap, or Herodotus, who also has a 1,400-year gap. There's some of the writings of Plato, which have a 1,200-year gap from the time that Plato wrote them to the manuscripts that we have right now. You've got Tacitus with a 950-year gap, Caesar with a 950-year gap, Pliny with a 750-year gap. So what would you guess would be a reasonable gap for the New Testament? And the gap that's thought in all of these is that these are a reasonable gap, and that they're reasonably reliable historical documents, even with that gap. Well, what you have for the New Testament is a gap of about 35 years. From the time that the Bible, the New Testament, was finished being written until the first piece of a manuscript that we can find, which is called the John Rylands Fragment, found in 125 A.D. The New Testament was likely finished somewhere around 90 A.D., and so there's a very short time gap. Now someone may say, well, that doesn't count. What if a fragment doesn't count, but you have to have the whole document, completely put together? Well, that would increase all of these as well, but it increases the Bible to a gap of about 180 years. That's the whole New Testament, all found in a single package in one place, about 180 years after the time that the New Testament was written. Either way, it's far less than any other historical document. So if you throw out the Bible because of the time gap that there was there, then you have to throw out every other document from all of world history from the time of the New Testament and say that, those aren't valid either. Then the other thing that we have is the other question is the question of how many manuscripts were written. Because the more manuscripts that were written, obviously the more you can compare them to each other. So if some monk at some point decides, hey, I'm going to change a verse here or there, then you would be able to compare that to others, if there were a lot of others that were out there that were different. So the second place competitor, once again, is the Iliad by Homer, with 643 manuscripts from antiquity. 643. It's a very credible historical document. The others on this list have markedly less than this. All of them have less than 100. Some have 9, some have 15, some have 23. What would you expect the distribution of the New Testament might be? Well, you can probably guess by the size of our graph that the New Testament has over 5,700 manuscripts or pieces of manuscript from antiquity in the original language in Greek. And you can compare these manuscripts to one another. So if somebody changed a manuscript somewhere along the line, say 200 years after it was written, well, you would have a load of other manuscripts that you can compare to that one, and you can tell which one had the deviation that was involved with it. 5,700 manuscripts or pieces of manuscript in the Greek, and then another 20,000 manuscripts in other languages. That's not even to mention that there were 30,000 quotes from the Bible in letters that were written by the early church fathers, from which you can reassemble nearly the entire Old Testament, New Testament, just from those quotes alone. The truth is that the Bible is unparalleled when it comes to the number of manuscripts. It simply smokes the competition. If you say that the Bible is not a reasonably reliable document because of manuscript evidence, again, you have to throw out everything else from history. So in conclusion, the Bible is the best book in history in its time when it comes to internal evidence. It's the strongest of its time when it comes to external evidence. It's the strongest of its time when it comes to manuscript evidence. The honest historian can only come to the conclusion, based on these premises, that the Bible is a reasonably reliable historical document.